Well, I heard of people who said they didn't want to be treated, and they just said okay, and the person died. And my response always is, that's not euthanasia, that's not assisted suicide, that's not medical assistance in death. That's simply good medical practice. You don't force feed people medication that they don't want to take. And people in the hospital aren't even debating those ones. But that's number one. The second one is this, and I think this is uncontroversial as well now. Didn't used to be, though. But now, shutting down the equipment to allow a person to die from the condition that they have. That's not assisted suicide or assisted death or anything like that either. That again, is just like we said earlier, that's allowing people to die from the condition they have, and it's only good medicine. And people and medical people have been doing that for a long time. The third one is sometimes harder for people to grasp, but I think it's critically important too, and that is this. Giving extra doses of painkiller to ease the pain, even if you know that it may result in the person dying sooner. How about that? Giving extra doses of painkiller to ease the pain, even if you know it may result in the person dying sooner. That is not assisted suicide, or assisted death, or medical assistance in dying. Because you see, these are all about intentions. The definition has been on the table for quite a while, at least one good definition of assisted suicide, assisted death, and I think probably medical assistance in dying, is that it's all about intentions. The definition goes something like this, is that one of these occurs when the physician provides the means or the method or both to a patient to request assistance in dying, and here's the important words, with the intention of helping that person die. It's all about intentions. That's when you move into truly assisted suicide or assisted death. And I find it critical to keep that clear. And you know who's actually helped us on this is Catholic theologians and Catholic philosophers with their doctrine of double effect. Some of you may be aware of that, but it's a very helpful doctrine which makes a distinction between something that is foreknown and something that is intended. That's just one of the principles. There's 4 principles there, but that's the key one. And in Catholic hospitals, they follow this to the T. I've talked with people in there, and I think we tend to follow it in other kinds of ways as well. Maybe not as explicitly, but we certainly should. I think it's a good distinction. So what's our big question here? What's a foundational question? Interestingly enough, I've also thought that foundational questions on any issue, whether it be this one or any other ethical question, are critical. And they need to be the kind of question which people on various sides would agree on. In other words, two people who would answer the question very differently need to at least agree on what they're disagreeing about. Otherwise they just talk past each other. So what's the question for this? Well, I'll tell you where I got this question from. You might be surprised, but Sven Robinson, former member of Parliament, he and I have had a number of dialogues and debates on this, and we can still maintain a friendship today. And I heard him put this question on the table, and I thought, and Sven's a lawyer, he's a very clear thinker, and I thought, this is the right question, and I'll give it to you just as he said it. He said this: should a person who is suffering and who no longer wants to endure their suffering be given the legal right to request and receive a physician's assistance in ending their life? That's the question, and I think that is the right question. And of course, you can answer it different ways. There's really 3 different views on it, two that are relevant for us today. And the first one is just to say yes. Second one to say, well, no, we think there's a better way. People who say yes to this use different analogies to show why they're doing this. Here's one analogy that I've heard before. It's like this. Just imagine this, that you come to a country and you see there's no cars on the road anywhere, and you say, what happened to all the cars? And say, well, our government came down with a law that because people were being harmed driving cars, they put a total ban on driving cars. Nobody can drive cars. You know, okay, that seems kind of extreme. Yeah, that's the way our government is. They do things extreme. Well, anyway, you come back here a month later and you say, no, that's what we feed people driving cars. You say, what happened? Well, the Supreme Court looked at that total ban and said that total ban is not necessary. They struck down the ban, the prohibition. They said it's okay to drive cars as long as you do so within these conditions and this framework. These safeguards is the term they're using here. And these rules, follow these rules of the road and you're free to drive cars. Well, no analogy is perfect, and you can see this is different driving cars here versus people's lives over here, ending people's lives. But it's the same kind of thing. People who argue that the answer to this question should be yes are saying, we don't need a total ban. There's reasons why the answer should be yes, primarily the right to personal autonomy, or why the answer should be yes, as long as we have good, proper safeguards. Of course, they're all debated ad nauseum, and they can be changed at the stroke of a pen, too. It's not as if they're guaranteed to stay the same, but that's the argument. The people who, I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, but the people who answer no are simply saying, well, there used to be an extreme version that said we should use every medical means at our disposal to keep every person alive as long as possible. I hear almost nobody advocating that today. And I can see why, because with the medical technology we have, all that would end up doing is prolong the dying process, increasing human suffering, and that's not the purpose of medicine and all that. So I don't find that. The people today who answer no to this question are the ones who are simply saying, look, rather than use the medical profession to intentionally end lives, why don't we seek to offer an alternative, the best palliative care we possibly can? And that we would prefer that. So that's the way that kind of reasoning works. Now, let me just make a quick comment on the key concerns of people on both sides, because my experience on this has been that whether you are in favor of legalizing medical assistance to dying or whether you're not, you can have some pretty compassionate people on both sides who, when you hear them talk in general, if you're willing to open your minds and listen, it's hard to fault them on that. They just got a different way of thinking about some of these issues. I'll give you three concerns that I've come across. This is not all of them, but three of the main ones, by people who are in favor and who are now quite happy that we've legalized medical assistance dying. The first one has to do with the respect for personal autonomy. I don't know if you remember back the name Sue Rodriguez from about 20-some years ago, who fought the hard fight to have this law overturned way back about 21 years ago. And at that point, the Supreme Court ruled against her 5-4. And she made this statement to the Supreme Court judges, but she made it publicly, since it's all over the place. The statement is something like this. It's a pretty well word for word. She said, gentlemen, if I can't give consent to my own death, then whose body is this? And it was a statement of personal autonomy. And then the argument is, do you really want the government? Should it be the government making your big life choices, or should it be you? Now, Christians will say, many Christians will say, well, look at, personal autonomy, that's a self-centered thing. God is really the one. Well, the people who argue this are saying, that's fine. You follow the will of God. That's so that we want to, you can have the freedom to do that. That's what we're saying here, is that are you free to follow whatever set of values you have, or is the government making those big decisions? Now, of course, there's lots of responses to this. The basic one is that we all recognize that personal autonomy alone is never enough reason to change public policy. You always have to ask other questions. The fact that somebody wants to do this or that is not enough reason to change public policy. Okay? You always have to ask other questions about the effects on society and all that. But that is a very foundational argument. The second concern is this. What I call a back alley assisted suicides. Anybody ever heard that term, or am I making that one up here afresh? You've heard of back alley abortions. It's the very same argument, back alley assisted suicide. This argument's been put forward by a person whose name is Russell Ogden, who I've met. He's in BC here. He's a professor at BC. Really a nice guy, too. And he's argued for a long time now. His argument has been, and he did research on this as an SFU master's degree student years ago, that whether or not you are in favor of legalizing medical assistance in dying, you should understand that if it's illegal, people will do it anyway. And some will be harmed in the process. And he himself compiled some really gory research. And to get the research, he had to ask people to divulge things they had done which were illegal, so he promised them he'd burn his research, which he did. And sure enough, the police came to him and the research was all burned. But he published his master's thesis anyway. Got fined $5,000 by the police for doing so, but he got a $5,000 award from SFU for having the most controversial research project that year. So it all worked out well for him, and we ended up getting some pretty interesting research out of the deal. But it's pretty gory reading. It's actual cases where people tried to help their friends die because they saw them dying anyway, but sometimes they were botched. So the term botched suicide has come into the discussion. And Russell Ogden just says, it doesn't matter how you feel about this. You must have to admit these things are happening anyway. So isn't it better, to use his words, to legalize it, to bring it out into the open where we can regulate it and make it more humane? You should at least be willing to admit that. And now this can be critiqued as well, but we don't need to worry about it. That's a key concern though. And the third one is this, an interesting concern. It's a concern about discriminating against vulnerable people. You might say, well, where's the concern about discriminating? This argument was actually made at the Supreme Court in the K. Carter case, Carter versus the People of Canada, back in 2015. although they didn't accept this argument. They still ruled in favor, but they didn't accept this argument. But the argument was just this, that back in 1972, we in Canada decriminalized suicide. It's now legal to attempt suicide. Of course, if you're successful, it's irrelevant whether it was legal or not. But if you're not successful, you could have faced prosecution before that. And so we made it legal. So now you wouldn't face prosecution. You would have suicide prevention measures, therapy, counsel, that kind of thing. And so now it's legal. But the argument is, as long as you have medical assistance in dying illegal, you are denying certain people, namely elderly people, some of them terminally ill people, some of them disabled people, you're denying them the right to do something which is legal and available to the rest of us, and that's discrimination against them, and namely to end their own life. It's a really interesting argument, and the question it comes down to is, well, is medical assistance in dying, is that a positive right? That you have a right to receive it from us, or is it simply a negative right? You have the right to go pursue one if you want. None of these have been clarified yet, but that is the argument. How about the concerns of those who have always opposed legalization? Let me just give you two here. The really big deal here has always been, isn't there a fundamental rule against killing? Is that a moral rule? It's in moral codes all around the world. The Bible, of course, virtually all moral codes. Isn't there a near universal agreement? A fundamental rule against killing human beings? Isn't this a violation of that? And of course, the response is, well, we have exceptions. We have capital punishment, not here in Canada, but we have it around certain places in the world. We have self-defense, have wartime killing, things like this. These are exceptions to the rule. Why? And the response back is, well, do we really need this to be another exception when we have a good alternative available? And that's how the reasoning goes back. But the fundamental argument is, we have a fundamental rule against killing, and we would really like to uphold that anywhere we can. And this has always been a really big concern. So now we use the medical profession not just to heal, but also to end people's lives. And it looks like a violation. The second one is one that I have to admit, I only came across this when I began doing my research. And I began meeting with people who work in the palliative care industry. And I'll pretty much end with this one. But the concern is this, that if we legalize something like medical assistance in dying, we change the world in a very negative way for our most vulnerable people in our world.